my perspective is very now. I've been here since 2007. Came from the US, where we kind of focus over there a lot on the now and not that much on before. And I'm sitting next to David and Anne in particular, who bring a great wealth of knowledge about the period in which Chatham House was created. The initial, of course, British Institute of International Affairs, as it was created when it was founded in 1920, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and an idea that at least came to fruition. It germinated well before that, but came to fruition during the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations. And to use my time, hopefully effectively, my sense of what's different between now and then is that I think, and hopefully David won't correct me, but he will if I'm wrong, that the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations were unique in that, well, they lasted for a hell of a long time. I think other treaty negotiations lasted a long time as well, but they involved experts as well, and academics, as well as policymakers, partly because of the complexity of what was going to be undertaken, national self-determination, redrawing of boundaries, not wanting to recreate the same problems as before. But this idea, one idea, that you would bring together academic experts, people with real knowledge of a particular situation or a place or a region or an ethnicity, and combine it with those people who have to make decisions on policy, that combination would lead to a better outcome than the kind of secret diplomacy alone that would take place in the previous congresses, was part, I think, of one of the energizing ideas of Chatham House at that time. So when people came back, they said, we need to keep that process going somehow. And I think there was a deeper belief that shining some light, and there's even in our existing Royal Charter and bylaws, there's the phraseology of the scientific study of international affairs, that maybe if you got experts together to look into things and study them, we would develop patterns and understandings that would then enable better outcomes to be delivered, and that the process of discussion would get you there. So Chatham House was founded very much around a process of debate and meeting and talking. The meetings and the members' meetings eventually evolving into study groups, the idea that you would study issues. I think I'll let other people talk about some of the study groups. And that this process of mixing policy and academic, discussing the issues, and then the Chatham House rule, giving that opportunity for the people from the government side at least. And I think I'm right in saying the FCO didn't want the British Institute to be founded when it was. They thought we'd be competition of some sort. But having been included in the meetings, we said, well, look, come and, you can speak frankly and you won't be betrayed. But that information needed to be got out. And I always say to people, Chatham House rule, it's all about confidentiality and keeping things in. No. The Chatham House rule is about getting ideas out. And being able to share them, but doing it in a way that people would speak frankly, and that, I think, applies to this day. So this idea of study groups has started. I think what is different today and what the Institute moved through, particularly in the 70s and 80s, is a focus on expertise, and that you needed to develop kind of research programs that would retain a constant capacity for knowledge within the Institute, rather than just bringing the members as experts around the table, that you would have full-time staff who would focus on issues of Latin America or Soviet Union or arms control or energy, international economics. These were all topics that emerged over the course, if I remember rightly, of the 70s through the 80s. And where we are today, I suppose, an institute that builds off and uses the convening capacity, the Chatham House rule at times, but on the record as well, and then seeks to also have almost a parallel process, but often drawing on our members, of coming up with ideas. If you've got that ability to create this great debate together, as other institutes do as well, and we're one of many, many hundreds, thousands, in fact, hundreds, certainly a few thousand institutes around the world. The point is that we all believe, and the reason we exist partly, is to take that capacity to convene, to get good ideas together, and then get them out in a shape in which governments and policymakers can use them and put them to use. So that ability to translate knowledge, debate, and information into formats and packages, and they keep evolving with technology and so on, but that can then be used by people in the policy world or those other much broader communities that now advise policy or influence it, civil society, the media, companies, etc., that we make sure we use that process. So I think the evolution, to me, the key one is from the debate part through to the debate as a basis from which to try to influence policy. And I'd say that's pretty much a pattern of what most institutes do here. And I see Camilla Toolman from IIED, and maybe would agree, and there may be other think tank representatives here, and policy institutes. I think that's what we think we do.
I want to take you back to 9th of November 1923, and a meeting that took place in this building on that day, on that evening, which is one of the meetings whose records you can read, actually, in the proceedings that have been digitized for us. And that was the meeting that was called to really mark another important occasion, which was the bequest, the Leonard bequest, that made it possible to move the Institute, British Institute, to Chatham House. And among the people who attended was the then Foreign Secretary, that's Lord Curzon. And he came in the middle of a crisis. Remember, the context in 1923 is that French and Belgian troops have occupied not only the Rhineland but also the Ruhr. German passive resistance has driven the German economy into hyperinflation, which is at its peak in November of 1923. Separatist uprisings have just taken place in the Rhineland with French support and have been unsuccessful. But there is a major crisis taking place on the continent of Europe in which one great power appears to be using various methods of economic pressure and subversion to destabilize and destroy the unity of another great power, which was a very weak one. And this crisis, of course, was to continue to run, if I take the story forward, until January 1924, when there was a run on the franc and a financial crisis, which forced the French government into a negotiating position. Now you may think I'm drawing a historical analogy. We were advised in our comments to discuss the pitfalls as well as the potential benefits of using historical analogy. Well, actually, I'm not going to pursue the analogy of the Ruhr any further, though it's interesting that no one else seems yet to have brought attention to it, of that precedent to the current analysis of the current situation. What I actually want to do is to look at not what Curzon said, but at what Sir Edward Grey said, the previous Foreign Secretary, who was also present at that meeting at Chatham House on 9th of November 1923. And what he did was go back to the objectives of the Founding Fathers, as Robin has said, in 1919. And what Grey mentioned was two things. Number one, a concern to act upon public opinion. What Grey actually said, that was without the backing of public opinion, no government can do anything much in foreign affairs. So acting on public opinion, from Grey's perspective, of course, acting on it in a pro-government direction. Secondly, the importance, as Robin has said, of expertise, of exchange of views between practitioners and academic experts within closed confines, but the outcome, the results of that process, to be communicated and to be diffused. So there is this kind of dual purpose there, right from the founding, which you can also find, actually, if you look at something that's not in the online documents, but is in the archives here. These are the records of the meeting at the Hotel Majestic in Paris on the 30th of May, 1919, which is usually taken as the sort of founding meeting that led to the drive and the establishment of Chatham House. And look particularly there at the role of Lionel Curtis, the Oxford academic, an academic entrepreneur who was the real moving spirit, though there were a number of other people there, both British and Americans, both practitioners and historians, but these were people who were attached to the Peace Conference delegations at the Paris Peace Conference and wanted to keep that kind of environment and milieu going. So this is about the background, both whether you look at 1923 or whether you look at 1919. Now what I want to do is to fast forward a bit to another major venture which took place in 1925. And this was the founding of the chair, actually, that I now hold, which is the so-called Stevenson Chair of International History at the London School of Economics. No relation of mine. It was endowed by Sir Daniel Stevenson, who was an enlightened, liberal-leaning Glasgow businessman with a lot of international experience. What was intended in 1925, the first holder of this chair, who was Professor Arnold Toynbee, had his role divided 50-50 between Chatham House and between the London School of Economics. And his objective was, his responsibilities were on the one hand to produce an annual survey of international affairs done here, and secondly to teach students in the University of London. Yeah? Now, this proved to be too much for one person to do, and after 1932, the role was split. So Toynbee carried on here, and Sir Charles Webster was brought in to do the teaching at the LSE and in London. Now, what I want to highlight from this, though, is another dimension being brought in. Yeah? Dimension 1 is educating or informing public opinion. Dimension 2, exchange of expertise and experience between practitioners. Dimension 3 is learning from history and the past. If you look at the correspondence not only of Curtis but Stevenson and the Webster and Toynbee, many of these people were actually at Paris as well, yeah? But they were all starting from the assumption that in the post-World War I period, disaster in 1914, another almost as great disaster in 1919 with the peace settlement from their perspective, you could learn from historical precedent about how to avoid repeating these mistakes in the future. So historical study was an eminently practical thing. And it was part of what Robin rightly called the kind of scientific mission. Something else which Gray, and I think also Curzon, stressed in 1923, about characteristic of the Institute's method, it would proceed from the facts. We may think this naive now, yeah? But Curzon talks about how difficult it is to extract the facts. But you start from the facts and you build your conclusions and recommendations from the facts, rather than starting with recommendations and selecting the facts that will support the recommendations. Yeah? That's very clear as part of the founding doctrine. Now, the problem, of course, is how you apply all this. And I think what I've distinguished here between two levels of expertise. Yeah? There's practical expertise from people who are directly involved in events and policy making. And there is, if you like, vicarious expertise to be derived from the reservoir of knowledge and from the historical background. Both can be relevant, but they have to be used in different ways. Now, I'm going to move forward just a little bit to the present situation and make some comments about how this might be applied in present circumstances. Of course, one general point, I don't think you need me to say this. If you look at the present international situation, it bears many resemblances with those before 1914, before 1939, and before the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Yeah? Shifting balance of power, powers going up, other powers going down, diplomatic crises, arms races, public opinion, varied elements, public opinion, extreme nationalism in some countries, great apprehension about the future in others. You don't need kind of much genius or much historical analysis to see that their present situation is dangerous. Now, I want to juxtapose that with a comment made by Tony Blair, actually, speaking to the American Congress in July of 2003, so just after the Iraq War, when he said to the American Congress that there has never been a time when, except in the most general sense, a study of history provides so little instruction for our present day. Yeah? So that's Blair in 2003 saying that we're in a new situation after 9/11, history is no longer relevant. What we're in now, in the last 10 years, we've moved into a situation which Bismarck would have much, I think, more closely recognized, yeah? A situation where the great danger now looks to be not so much terrorist outrage, though that may have just receded rather than disappearing, but interstate conflict, possibly even old-fashioned war. Now, finally, I said I'd make a few comments about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I just want to highlight this, because this is the best example we have, or a very good example, of an American president who was very historically minded and trying to learn historical lessons in handling an acutely dangerous situation. What's always quoted is his citing of Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August on 1914. But actually, he'd written his Harvard thesis about Munich in 1938-39, and he draws lessons from both, though the lessons may be conflicting potentially. But actually, he runs the crisis on a basis of coercion as well as conciliation. And if you look at the records of the ExCom meetings in '62, they draw on other examples too, such as the danger of doing a reverse Pearl Harbor, or 1956, that if you attack Suez, the Russians attack Hungary, if you attack Cuba, the Russians attack Berlin. So a lot of examples brought here to cite in general in favor of restraint. The most important single lesson, though, that Kennedy learns from the past is from the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and his subsequent meeting with Eisenhower, who said, don't do another thing like this without getting all your advisors together and hearing exhaustive analysis of the pros and cons. Yeah? So the historical analysis was useful. It's most important in the early stages of the crisis in signaling out the potential dangers and possible things to be thought about, yeah? Keeping people open-minded, that's what I'd really stress. But as you move towards the later stages of the crisis, the Americans stop talking about historical analogies and they focus on the task in hand. So I come back to the point I made at the beginning. Historical analogy is useful, but its use is limited. The direct expertise is invaluable as well. Historians can supplement that. They cannot replace it.
What I want to do is very tentatively to look at the current Ukraine crisis in the light of the talk that's very widespread in the press and media about a new Cold War. And if you Google Ukraine Cold War, you have to gulp because there's so many pages of hits. And so we international historians of the Cold War find ourselves in a rather alarming position. We're back in the limelight, apparently. And I have to say, the Cold War was not a comfort zone. It seems to some who may be confused by globalization, and everyone's a bit confused by globalization, that it's quite neat to have an identifiable enemy, an other, somebody you can pin down. Armchair strategists are quite prone to that. But I should remind the audience that the costs of the Cold War were extremely high. They were extremely high in terms of the richness of our lives and costs, and for those on both sides of the old Iron Curtain. What I'm going to do is a bit nerdy, I suppose, but I'm thinking of one document that is in the new archive. And it's a Chatham House study group that published its book, it's a booklet, in 1950. And they came up with one brilliant catchphrase, a very pertinent set of tactics, and some very interesting observations about how they saw the world in 1949-50. Let me start with the catchphrase. They defined the Cold War, and many of my academic colleagues will be very familiar with this, as all mischief short of war. All mischief short of war. But the study group went on to elaborate what kind of tactics they saw being deployed. These were political devices, i.e., teasing diplomacy, economic devices, propaganda, and the use of paramilitary forces. So these were these four forms of tactics that they saw around them in the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. Now, my own view is that to call the Ukraine crisis a new Cold War, which some people have done, is misleading and possibly dangerous. However, one has to say that those tactics resonate with anyone, I'm sure, who has to make policy. The study group went on, however, to flag up some of what they saw in the world around them and in Europe around them, and it shows us how different the world was then. The first was the preoccupation with ideology. There was a genuine quest to try and figure out what communism was about, whether Stalinism was a form of communism or whether it was a land grab masked by communist ideology. They concluded that the communism was for real and that the Soviet Union should be seen as a global, not a regional power. I'm pointing these out and leaving you to make your own comparisons with the Ukraine today. The study group was not so concerned with borders because, like it or not, borders had pretty much been decided. Cuius regio, eius religio. I've always longed to quote Latin in Chatham House. I've done it. I'm happy now. I shall die happy. That borders were not such a concern because Yalta and Potsdam and the settlement across Germany and Europe was more or less something that couldn't be altered. There was not such a concern about the democratic values that were being perhaps lost or not developed, about human rights. There was not such a concern as there had been around the First World War about nationalism and self-determination. And Britain was quite different. They had a real sense of Britain's obligations. Leadership in 1945 was not a fantasy project of any prime minister. It was a serious business with Germany out of the game, Europe largely out of the game, the United States an uncertain presence, and none of the gallimaufry of international organizations that we have today. So my lesson I draw from the study group, and anyone can read it, is that we may pick lessons, but there's not a replication. To say we're in a new Cold War is to use the words inaccurately. Containment won't do whatever Obama says. Containment is not a viable tactic or strategy in a globalized world. We are interdependent. Moreover, the Ukraine is not a bridge. Who wants to live on a bridge anyhow? Even if it's the Ponte Vecchio, you'd be cramped. It may be a pivot for strategists, but it's not a bridge. And NATO's saber rattling both seems antediluvian, but also potentially very dangerous. Because if you take worst case analysis, which is what some Cold Warriors were doing by the 50s, you may land up with worst case outcomes. However, we lacked speed of decision making after the Second World War. We now have that speed of decision making. If we can make communications, back channels, empathy of what a country that's been through, not the beginning of the Cold War, but the end of the Cold War, if we can make sense of that, if we can act grown up to find common problems rather than creating a sort of morphed bipolar world, I think then we would learn some very good lessons from the early Cold War.
It's 32 years since I first came through the doors up there. 32 years in which I've only gradually become convinced that I am no longer an enfant terrible. 32 years, then I was a researcher for a program called Weekend World, who the Jurassic amongst you will remember. A program which was at that stage presented by a man called Brian Morden. Weekend World was that fairly short-lived thing, which was an extremely high-end analytical television program, which was allowed to exist because ITV was making so much money that it didn't care if it spent a bit on this, and it was a condition of its licensing because advertising was so lucrative in the independent television field at the time. As soon as it wasn't so lucrative anymore, the entire genre disappeared. Possibly Romans in the 350s or 400s, etc., it disappeared to, at first, our extraordinary surprise, and then our realization that it had been inevitable. But the reason why Weekend World sent me here was that we had, I don't know if it was called a group membership or whatever it was called, but we had it. We had it because Weekend World liked to take on the big issues of the world, and what it liked to do was to try and discover for any particular issue, whether it be the Israeli-Palestinian issue or anything else, and indeed, since it's been brought to mind, I learned everything I knew about the ladder of escalation during the late Cold War at the feet of various people who'd been at Chatham House and so on. We did it because we liked to find the dilemma upon which the issue turned. And in order to just do that, we had to distill the information. We had to get the best advice we could possibly get on what was most important in the situation, what was the central feature of the... When you pared it right down, when you got rid of all the sort of penumbra, what was the thing fulcrum upon which this thing turned? Of course, in a way, that is a kind of journalistic crudification, but actually it was also a very useful exercise. And here at Chatham House, what you discovered, or what you could get in contact with, was people who had been to the places we were talking about, talked to the people who we would probably find difficulty in talking to, although sometimes they would put their finger on who those people should be, and we would go and interview them. Of course, we had to take a punt. I remember taking a punt after the death of Brezhnev in 1983. There were distinct schools of thought. You will recall there was a school of thought that thought there would not be any significant change in the Soviet Union. Things would pretty much run on as before. And I remember an academic from Birmingham, a guy called Ron Amman, who said why this was not possible, why the economic and innovatory capacities of the Soviet Union were falling so far badly behind the West that actually, in fact, there would have to be some kind of form of significant reform process. It, A, was what I wanted to hear, because I like new stuff, and B, turned out to be right, and so we put it together, and Weekend World essentially called the thing correctly. So this was an immensely valuable place for a researcher to be, and at the early stages of a kind of, if you like, a kind of serious journalistic thing to do. It was also the place where we discovered this thing called Chatham House rules, a more abused term generally than this, I do not know in the journalistic world, because very, very many people think it means off the record. For the record, it doesn't mean off the record. It just means we don't say who said the thing that we said somebody said. To me, I am incredibly suspicious of all such conventions and so on, since they are, in Shaw's famous words, conspiracies against the laity and so on. But nevertheless, that's what it means and not what everybody else seems to think it means. So that convention was extremely useful as well. Now, if we come on 30 years, the world has changed absolutely and dramatically in terms of your capacity and where you get information from, even as a high-end journalist, and that is depending on whether, in fact, you can find a vehicle for your high-end journalism in the first place. But let us suppose that working for the Times or working for some of the bigger magazines, the New Yorker and so on, you still have a significant interest in telling your readers, as far as you can, what is going to happen to bring them to the heart of the dilemma of whatever major issue there is. The digitisation of the archive is an absolute, and not just of the archive, by the way, but gradually of all papers made available by Chatham House and all events run by Chatham House and so on, and the quicker the better, becomes an absolutely essential part of that armoury. We are no longer going to send people to long and difficult meetings and so on in order to, on the off chance that we might discover something. Life is too short, and our capacity to look at other things is too great. I'll give you a very short example, and then I think we should move on to your questions. Most journalists now use Twitter. Now, if I had a penny for every time somebody says to me, "Oh, Twitter, no, I can't be bothered. This is a waste of time for me. I really can't be bothered with any of that," etc. And I just think, fool. Okay, I'll be absolutely blunt with you. I think, fool. Twitter is the most useful journalistic resource for this reason. You can become instantly in touch with what people are saying in countries you're not in yourself. Some of the best correspondents, in fact, almost all the best correspondents in the world, tweet from where they are. That's how I know, before probably anybody else does, or most other people do, exactly what's happening in Ukraine. You remember how long it might take to get something from Da Nang. You remember how now the new words are places like Slovyansk, places you've never heard before that suddenly achieve a kind of extraordinary salience. And we all talk about Slovyansk, yet 5 years ago, none of us in this room, apart from Ukraine specialists, would have known where Slovyansk was. And so maybe World War II specialists would know, but I don't think so. So these tools are instant. Those other people will give you links to long-form articles which you can instantly pick up, which will give you some understanding of the situation, will provide you with a briefing. It is essential that organisations like Brookings and Chatham House are very much integrated into that business of giving people the briefings that they need, and quickly. If they do it on a subscription basis partially, well, so be it. Then people will subscribe, although it would be better if a fair bit of it was actually left open. I entirely buy the points that Anne made about this being an interdependent world, even if it takes me in a different direction in terms of policy than I think I understood Anne was going, because I thought she was going one way and then she went off the other way, and I thought, well, this is all
time for question and answer, isn't it?
It is. But so I think I'll just finally say how much, therefore, I welcome the digitisation of the archive, and I welcome actually almost the digitisation of anything. If all of you around the room want to become digitised, that's great too, and we'll all be digital together.